My name is Gilad Aini, a senior research analyst at Camera, and I want to thank you all for joining us today. I wish, and I'm sure we all wish, it were for a better occasion. By this point, you've probably all done Zoom briefings, so I'll just remind you that you can ask questions at any point during the presentation by clicking on the Q&A link at the bottom of your screen, and at the end of the briefing, we'll try to get to as many of those as we can. I want to give a quick overview of the terrible events in Israel before inviting my colleagues Tamar, Alex, Ricky, and Sean to delve further into events on the ground and to zoom in on background that's absolutely necessary for understanding today's news. More broadly, we hope to answer what so many people, especially our friends and family who don't necessarily follow the conflict so closely, are asking. And that is, what is happening on the ground and why is it happening? And with Camera's central mission being accurate and ethical media coverage, in other words, that fulfills the promises made by journalists to us, their readers, we of course also want to think about how the conflict is being portrayed and distorted. For those who don't know us, Camera is the Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting and Analysis. And after years, actually decades of monitoring the media, Camera is recognized as the voice promoting accurate and honest coverage of the Middle East. We correspond directly with reporters and editors, spurring the correction of hundreds of errors every year. And when needed corrections aren't forthcoming, we keep the public informed of both the journalistic shortcomings and of the facts that are needed. And we're able to perform our critical work because of your critical support. On our website, www.camera.org, alongside our recent media analyses, you can find there also the big red donate button that keeps us in business and helps keep the media in check. Here's some of what we've seen from the media in the past few days. The LA Times told readers that the US expressed its concern over the planned eviction of several hundred Palestinians in eastern Jerusalem. My colleague Tamar, who you'll be hearing from shortly, got them to correct this wild exaggeration, and now the paper acknowledges that it's roughly 30 Palestinians involved in this rent dispute. And I'm in awe, Tamar, that you fought to get this changed in the spare time you had between running with your family to the bomb shelter. Yesterday, CNN's Ben Wiedemann argued, with what I imagine was a straight face, that Jerusalem has never been more divided in its history. And the only way we can even consider weighing this proposition is if we assume history doesn't include the years between 1948 and 1967, which were the 19 years before Israel reunified the city, 19 years during which it was sliced through its heart by rolls of barbed wire, when Jews couldn't visit their holy sites or even enter the eastern side of the city, when synagogues were razed to the ground and armed border guards from enemy countries stood on either side of the divide. Whatever heartbreaking tensions might have been awakened in recent weeks, the situation today is that Jews and Arabs intermingle on both sides of the city, intermingle together, which is to say that CNN is rewriting history in order to incriminate Israel. Meanwhile, NPR's Daniel Estrin insists that East Jerusalem, which means the old city, the Jewish quarter, the Western Wall, he insists all of this is formally and rightly Palestinian territory, which is advocacy for one side's demands, not impartial journalism. But in this conflict, the most problematic stuff is, I think, more intangible. It's reporting that too often aims to push a narrative, a tired, old narrative of victimhood and oppression. And this simplistic, distorted narrative rarely reflects the dynamic realities on the ground. One way to understand the journalistic loyalty, the fealty to this narrative, is to look at the New York Times opinion pages from this past week. A week, let's remember, during which nearly a full half of the world's remaining Jewish population are being attacked by rockets fired by an anti-Semitic group. This week, 2 days ago, the Times published a guest essay from the Palestinian point of view. Today, they balanced that out with a guest essay from also the Palestinian point of view. A third essay by Nicholas Kristof suggests that the American aid that helps pay for Israel's anti-rocket Iron Dome system should be withheld. And another by Peter Beinart argued that the Jewish state should cease to exist. Thus far, moving voices of Israelis under fire, humanizing voices that could help Americans understand the urgency of stopping Hamas, have been excluded, have been effectively silenced by Times opinion editors. So forgive your friends for not having a fully informed point of view about the conflict, but enlighten them. And so what are some of the broad conclusions people are learning from recent media coverage? Did this violence start because Israel is supposedly ethnically cleansing Jerusalem? That's what some reporters want us to believe, even as they conceal the fact that since Israel reunited the city, the Arab population has consistently grown faster by far than the Jewish population in Jerusalem. That's not what ethnic cleansing is. It's inaccurate and it cheapens the word to use it. But then what's going on with the 4 Palestinian families who might get evicted from Jerusalem, which we've all read about? Well, according to Palestinian human rights expert Bassem Eid, this issue was just a pretext, that's his word, for Hamas. But it has been central to news coverage, so Alex is going to talk more about that in just a few minutes. And if Hamas's deadly rocket attacks targeting civilians, and if the rioting in Jerusalem can't be explained or excused by ethnic cleansing, then what is the explanation? Did Palestinian groups in Gaza dust off their arsenals in response to clashes between Palestinians and Israelis on the Temple Mount? Or because of the provocative route of a parade on Jerusalem Day? That's what some coverage tries to suggest. But just look at the timeline. A rocket was fired at Israel from Gaza on April 15th. That's a month ago. Another rocket was fired on April 16th. And 36 rockets were fired at Israel on the 24th of April. But the clashes on the Temple Mount near the Al-Aqsa Mosque weren't until 2 weeks later, on May 7th. Jerusalem Day wasn't until May 10th. So something doesn't add up here. There are a lot of efforts being expended to convince Americans that indiscriminate rockets being fired at Jewish civilians by anti-Semitic terror organizations are somehow Israel's fault. We can't accept that framing silently. And by the way, the route of that Jerusalem Day parade, it was changed. And this was in hopes of avoiding provocation. Maybe that was a good idea, but it didn't, and it couldn't keep the region free of provocation, because there are other provocations to violence that too many journalists are loath to acknowledge. Early this month, for example, a senior Hamas leader, a former interior minister, called on his television audience to, quote, cut off the heads of Jews. Those were his words. Buy a 5-shekel knife, he said, and with your hand, cut their artery from here to here. He did a little demonstration for the audience. And what have the Jews done to deserve this presumably very slow decapitation using a 5-shekel knife? The Jews have spread corruption and have acted with arrogance, he told his audience. It's ugly stuff. But surely this was a reference to recent events in Jerusalem, right? Well, in 2019, 2 years ago, this very same Hamas leader also called on Palestinians living throughout the world, in Europe and America, to, quote, attack every Jew possible in all the world and kill them. That was also before this Jerusalem Day. That was 2 years ago. Media outlets ignored that comment just as they ignored the one from last week. And just as they seem to forget that Hamas decided to attack Israel also in 2006, 2009, 2014, 2019, and in between. Ricky is going to talk a little bit more about recent incitement by Palestinian leaders, especially the type of incitement that for the last century could be relied upon to gin up anti-Jewish violence, which is claims that Jews are harming or sullying the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem on the Temple Mount. And if that type of incitement helps explain the violence in the streets of Jerusalem, the rioting, the stone throwing, the physical assaults on Haredi Jews that are uploaded to TikTok, we should still think about why Hamas and Fatah have been increasingly broadcasting such incitement on TV stations and in mosques. Why fan the flames now? Obviously, there's an ongoing conflict between Israel and Palestinians that stems in large part from a refusal to accept the existence of a Jewish state anywhere in the Middle East. But as much as Palestinian leaders might want to pretend everything is about Israel, this is still a society, obviously, that suffers from its own internal problems. And sometimes it's precisely because those internal problems that they feel the need to redirect focus onto Israel. So Sean, my colleague, will spend a few minutes later talking about the context, the essential context, maybe the most important context of the internal dynamic in the West Bank and Gaza. How do canceled Palestinian elections factor into all of what we've been seeing in recent days? But first, I'm going to turn the microphone over to Tamar to update everyone with a view from Jerusalem. Tamar?
Thank you so much for that introduction, Gilad. And thank you to everyone who's tuning in with us. I am speaking with you from Modi'in in central Israel, which means that I am one of 5.5 million Israeli citizens who are now under fire for the last 2 days. In Modi'in, we've had 3 sirens, 2 overnight in the middle of the night, last 2 nights, and 1 2 evenings ago. But I consider our situation very fortunate. We have a safe room. I'm actually sitting in it right now. If a siren goes off, I will stay where I am and my family will come in and join me. So it's very scary to run in the night with your children to seek shelter. However, we're fortunate because we have 90 seconds to do so. And I know that the people, the communities right along the Gaza border and up to Ashkelon, they have 15 seconds. And many people live in older buildings, older apartments, which don't have safe rooms. And that is the situation that an elderly woman and her caretaker from India found themselves in. They were in their apartments after they'd been told it was okay to leave the shelters, which again, were not in their home, but downstairs, and they didn't have time to make it to the shelter. My role tonight in this panel is to give you an overview of events on the ground of the last day. And there are really 2 major elements, 2 challenges that the country is dealing with right now. One is the rockets, and the other is the civil unrest, the violence in mixed Arab-Jewish communities. So I'll start with the rockets. That's the story that gets more attention internationally. Although I do think the second issue is more insidious in terms of providing challenges with how do we get out of that situation, and I'll come to that. So from Monday, when this all started with the rockets, until noon today, and these are figures from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, 1,200 rockets were launched at Israel, the southern part of the country and the center. And we have 7 fatalities on the Israeli side, 6 by rockets, and 1 soldier by the border was killed by an anti-tank missile. Among those casualties on the Israeli side was a boy in Sderot of 7 years old who was in his shelter, in his safe room, just like I'm sitting in one right now. And it's not clear yet how exactly some shrapnel penetrated the safe room where he was sitting, but he was killed. And his brother was severely injured and his mother was injured as well. There have been, until noon today, 281 injuries. But these numbers keep rising because they don't take into account the rocket attacks that have been coming in over the course of the day, which are bombarding southern Israel. Also, there was a major bombardment of both Tel Aviv area and Beersheba around 3:15 today. I know the Tel Aviv attack involved a couple dozen rockets, at least, maybe 35 rockets. Sorry, that was at 2:45 today. So since 6 p.m. last night until 6 a.m. this morning overnight, it was a very noisy, difficult night, especially for communities in the south. I mentioned Iran, but the people closer to the border were subjected to a much more sustained bombardment. There were 310 rocket launches. And today, from midnight until now, there have been 160 launches, and that's updated until not so long ago. Hamas at noon claimed that it had maintained that it had suffered 83 casualties, including 17 minors and 487 wounded. Remember, when you see in the media reports from health officials from the Gaza Strip, that those health officials are Hamas. Hamas, the terrorist organization designated as a terror group by the United States, by Israel, the European Union, and others, the very same terror organization which has brought us to this conflict, which is launching rockets, thousands of rockets at Israeli civilians from its civilian population. So we need to be skeptical of these numbers. We need to remember in the past that Hamas has had inflated the number of casualties that it suffered among its fighters, falsely claiming that they inflated the number of civilian casualties, falsely casting combatants as civilians. According to the IDF, the number Israeli military, the numbers that of casualties on the Palestinian side have been lower, and dozens of them, are terrorists. And also among the casualties are those killed by Hamas rockets, which were misfired. Now, a very interesting statistic to keep in mind in this round of violence is that something like 20% or even more of the rockets that Hamas has fired off toward Israel misfired and fell short, landing on Palestinian territory, killing Palestinian civilians. And we even have confirmation of this fact from a Palestinian NGO called Defense for Children International, which is affiliated with another terror group called the PFLP. And besides killing their own civilians, they misfired Hamas rockets have also managed to severely damage their infrastructure, which has serious impact, detrimental effect for their civilian population. A security official confirmed today that a misfired rocket damaged the electricity lines in the Gaza Strip. And as a result, 230,000 Gazans have now been cut off from electricity. In addition, a power line to the Rafah sewage treatment plant was damaged as a result of Hamas rockets, and lines to the Gaza sewage treatment plant are down, all because of failed misfired Hamas rockets. In addition, another one of these misaimed rockets disabled the Gaza desalination plant, which the population depends upon for water. So 250,000 Palestinians in the Gaza Strip now don't have access to clean water, to their water supply because of Hamas rockets. Another characteristic feature of this round of fighting that we should keep in mind is that Hamas has attempted to overwhelm Israel's defense system, the Iron Dome, which is highly effective in shooting down rockets, with over 90% of those that it targets successfully intercepted and shot down. However, what Hamas has been doing with its attacks on central Israel, and earlier today also in Beersheba, has been to try to overwhelm the system by firing off so many at one time. And indeed, that has succeeded at times with direct hits in the last day. For instance, in the last day or maybe 2 days on Ashkelon, overnight Rishon LeZion, Cholon, Givatayim, and Petach Tikva, where one of our camera researchers live. And there have been residences that have been hit by direct fire due to rockets that made it through the Iron Dome. Also, it's important to point out that the Ben Gurion airport has been targeted. As a result of that, the authorities took the decision to divert incoming flights to land at the Ramon airport in the south near Eilat, and to disembark passengers there, and then to fly to Ben Gurion Airport in central Israel next to Lod in order to pick up outgoing passengers. Hamas has obviously keeping up with the news, and they've also targeted the airport in Ramon near Eilat. That was today. So on the IDF side, the army has been hitting back at Hamas targets, Hamas infrastructure and assets across the Gaza Strip. Today, the army prevented 4 anti-tank missile attacks. One such attack yesterday did succeed in killing an Israeli soldier. So the fact that they're able to prevent these is very significant. Other Hamas infrastructure that was hit today was a building housing intelligence offices, the Hamas main bank, rocket production centers, counterintelligence infrastructure, naval force squads, and also the IDF neutralized a terror tunnel, which was located under a school in the Gaza Strip. One feature about this round of fighting that's different from 2014 is that Israel built a barrier underground in Israeli territory to prevent these tunnels from coming in. So we've pretty much successfully eliminated, we hope, the possibility that terrorists from the Gaza Strip will be able to tunnel underground into Israeli territory. They can come up into a small buffer of Israeli territory, but the barrier is before Israeli communities. So it seems that the terrorists have tried to overcome this challenge to one of their assets. By now, they've turned to a new tactic today, which is attack drones. They sent a number of attack drones over the border, which the army successfully intercepted and destroyed. And residents by the border were warned to stay in their homes because of these attack drones. And then Israel attacked the apartment that was used as the logistical center and the production center, I suppose, for the head of this drone operation. Another major development today is that troops are amassed at the border. The IDF General Staff was presented with various plans for approval for a ground invasion. And then at that point, it's ready to go from there to the political leadership for approval. And so it does seem that that is likely to go forward. As I mentioned at the beginning, the other big element to what we're facing now is really what I find much more difficult to deal with, because we've been there before with the rocket attacks. We know at a certain point, I suppose, when the political leadership and the IDF decide that they've reached their goals in terms of cutting Hamas's abilities to keep attacking the South. I think that the goal this time will be to stop the trickle of rocket attacks that go on between the big explosions. Is the civil unrest, and that is in all mixed cities in Israel. And the epicenter has been Lod, which is in central Israel, less than a 15-minute drive from here. Masses of Arab gangs attacking Jews, and the scenes that I watched on television last night, and they're anticipated to recur again tonight, were horrifying. I saw a Jewish young couple with a baby being evacuated from their apartment. They were surrounded by more than a dozen border policemen to secure them to safety, and everyone was in shock by these scenes. It's a total battleground there in Lod, and there are warnings about massive rioting and attacks in Haifa as well. In Akko, a hotel was burned, a visitor center. The guests in the hotel in Akko were injured and had to be evacuated. A civil emergency event was declared in Lod, which means that the police and the rescue forces and others have received enhanced power. Curfew is in effect tonight, meaning that people are only allowed to leave their homes from 8 o'clock tonight if they need to run to a shelter if the sirens go off, or if they need emergency medical care. And any violation of this curfew can result into up to 3 years of imprisonment. As I said, there's been burning of synagogues, community centers, cars have been put in flames, houses have been broken into, and the scenes are very difficult to look into, to see. Today in Lod, I saw just now a soldier was beaten and reportedly shot. A Jewish man was stabbed. And also, unfortunately, it's painful to see that there is violence going in the other direction with far-right Jewish extremists attacking random Arabs. There was an Arab woman in Lod who was hit in the head with a rock. I believe she was pregnant. Far-right Jewish gang set out from Bat Yam last night, intending to go to Jaffa to attack Arabs there. They were stopped. They vandalized Arab-owned businesses, and they brutally beat up an Arab man. And this was caught on Israeli live television last night, and it horrified, really galvanized the leadership to speak out, the Jewish leadership to speak out against violence. And on the last day, also the Arab leadership has also spoken to its population about the need to keep the peace and law and to avoid violence. There has been a major call-up today of border police reservists, 10 companies. And I'm just going to wrap up because we have many additional speakers and a lot to get through, but I do want to leave with just two small silver linings in all of this bad news. And that is, so far, the northern front seems to be stable. Does not look like Hezbollah will be intervening in this conflict. For now, that's the situation. So that's something to be thankful for. And despite Hamas's best efforts and wishes, mass violence has not been unleashed in the West Bank. Yes, there have been violent incidents there, but the kind of large-scale, widely spread intifada has just not materialized despite Hamas's wishes. So for that, we can also be thankful too. And from here, I'll pass it on to Alex. Thanks again.
Thanks very much, Tamar, for that very interesting on the up to the minute briefing. What I'm going to be talking about is the situation in Sheikh Jarrah. Sheikh Jarrah has been in the news recently, as Gilad mentioned, because there's a real estate dispute going on there that is being used by the media and Palestinians in order to inflame passions and paint Israel in a very bad light. And one thing to remember, if you see coverage about this, is that contrary to what most of the coverage says and most of the media says, this is a private real estate dispute between Jewish owners and Palestinian tenants who refuse and have refused for many, many years to pay rent. Very rarely in the coverage do we hear anything about that. The Israeli government is not trying to evict anyone. This is a private real estate dispute, which is being, I think, ginned up by Palestinian NGOs, by foreign NGOs, and by the Palestinian Authority to encourage these tenants to keep up this dispute and refuse to pay the rent that they owe. Now, another aspect, which I'll get into, is the claim that there are unfair Israeli laws, that somehow Israeli Jews can recover property that they lost in the West Bank and in Jerusalem, but Palestinians are not able to recover property. And this is a very gross distortion, a very serious distortion of the actual situation. Now, Sheikh Jarrah is known for a couple of reasons. It's the site of the American Colony Hotel, which a lot of people have heard of. It's the site of the former Orient House that used to be in the news so much in the 1980s and 1990s, the home of Faisal Husseini, the late Faisal Husseini. It's also a holy site. It contains a holy site for Jews. Sheikh Jarrah is the site of the tomb of Simon the Just. He was a prominent Second Temple high priest, and many other interesting stories about him in his history. And the tomb is regarded as a Jewish holy site and has for hundreds of years been a site for Jewish pilgrimage. In 1876, the tomb and about 18 dunams of land adjacent to the tomb were purchased by a consortium of Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews. The Sephardic Jews built homes on their half of the property. The Ashkenazi Jews never did build any homes there, and so the land remained vacant. Up until the 1930s, the maximum size was the maximum population in the Jewish homes was a couple of hundred people. In response to the Arab violence of the 20s and 30s, that declined, and finally the remaining Jews had to flee with the start of the war in 1948, when the Jordanians invaded Judea and Samaria and were about to enter Jerusalem. After the war, the Jordanian custodian of enemy property took all the Jewish land on the West Bank, and interestingly enough, also land of Israeli Arabs, because the Israeli Arabs were now citizens of an enemy country, and so land of both Jews and Arabs, who were Israelis, was taken by the custodian of enemy property, Jordanian custodian. Now, if the land taken by the custodian is then further taken by the Jordanian government by eminent domain, or to put it to some public use, then what's being held by the custodian is no longer the land, but rather the money that was received for the land. So on the books of the custodian, there will either be actual land with the names of the Jewish owner, or the monetary value that was received when the land was sold to the Jordanian government, for instance. Now, give you some examples of this. The Dheisheh refugee camp near Jerusalem is entirely built on Jewish-owned land. Refugee camps at Anata and Kalandia are built in part on Jewish-owned land. Now, after 67, Jews had no ability, the Jewish owners of this land, I believe Dheisheh was JNF land, I'm not sure of that, but I believe that was a large plot of JNF land. They were not able to reclaim that property and evict, the refugee camp. The most they were able to do was get the monetary value back, or some approximation of the monetary value back. The Jordanian government also built government buildings in East Jerusalem on Jewish-owned land, and the same thing. Jewish owners did not get to take that land back. The most they got was the monetary value. Now, in 1956, the Jordanian government and the UN reached an agreement with regard to the vacant Ashkenazi land in Sheikh Jarrah. And the agreement was that the custodian of enemy property would allow the Jordanian Development Authority or Ministry to develop this land, and the UN agreed that they would build homes for Palestinian refugees there who would agree to move out of the refugee camps, wherever they were, and would also agree to give up their ration cards. So they were still refugees legally, but they would give up their ration cards, which in part were paid for by the Jordanian government and by the UN. So they would give up their rations, their UN benefits, and they would live in these homes. Now, the project went ahead, the homes were built, 28 families moved in. What's unique about the situation, however, is this land was never sold by the Jordanian custodian. It was leased out to the Development Authority, who paid the custodian, and the UN, as I said, paid to build the houses, but the land stayed on the books as owned by this Jewish consortium. And so in 1967, that land that had been held by the Jordanian custodian of enemy property passed over to the Israeli custodian of property, the general custodian. And the Jewish owners, in this case, discovered that they still had land on the books that could be recovered. And so their successors started the process to recover the land that they owned. As I said, this is an exceptional case because the land was never sold or transferred for any other use. It was still on the books as Jewish owned. So they filed the proper papers, went through the proper legal process, and regained control of the land, and including the homes that were built upon their land. And they then contacted all the Palestinian tenants and said, we are the owners of this land. Please start paying your rent to us. And the Palestinians refused. Some of the Palestinians claimed that according to some side agreement that they actually had received title to the homes and therefore they own the homes. No such agreement has been found as far as I know. There's no evidence of any such agreement. They were tenants and they had rental agreements. And these rental agreements have been found and looked at. And so there's no question that the land was Jewish owned. I would say the best evidence that the land is Jewish owned is the fact that the Jordanian custodian of enemy property took the land and no one objected. No alleged Palestinian owner or Arab owner came forward at the time and said, wait, this is my land. You're building homes for Palestinians on my land. No one ever said that. So there's no question that the land was Jewish owned, despite claims to the contrary today. In 1982, lawyers for the Palestinians and lawyers for the Jewish owners got together before the court and hammered out an agreement. And that agreement was that the Palestinians would accept that this was Jewish-owned property and that they owed rent and would pay rent according to their lease agreement, but they would be then regarded as protected tenants. Now, what protected tenants means in the context of Israel and much of the Middle East is you basically cannot be evicted. You cannot be forced to leave. If you pay the rent and you don't do any unauthorized renovations or changes and you take care of the apartment, you can't be forced to leave. Even if the landlord decides he really wants the unit for himself or whatever, it doesn't matter. You're protected. You can't be forced out. And you can also pass the apartment to your heirs. If you move out, you will lose the apartment. But if you stay there and then you decide to give it to your heirs can then become the protected tenants for the apartment. So that's what happened. That's where things stood until just a short time after the agreement. For some reason, the Palestinian tenants most of the Palestinian tenants renounced the agreement. They said that they were they were the actual owners. They went back to claiming they were the owners, denying Jewish ownership of the land, and refusing to pay any rent. So the Jewish owners then went to court to try to get these people evicted if they continued to refuse to pay rent. And believe it or not, I mean, that was in the 1980s. So we're talking 40 years on. This is still ongoing. Some of the Palestinian tenants who refused to pay rent have been evicted. There are a number that remain. There are at least 30 that are involved in the current dispute and face eviction. There are some tenants apparently who paid rent and never faced eviction. It's been a very long process, as I said, but a number have been evicted. The question is, why do these Palestinian tenants continue this process and set up tents outside the property once they're evicted? It's a big show, basically. It's a great PR campaign. This is a great PR point for the Palestinians, which the Western media just laps up. The belief is that they're being paid to do this, that they're being compensated to do this. Otherwise, they would just pay rent. It's much easier to pay rent than it is to get evicted and to supposedly live in a tent outside the property and have the tent demolished, etc. It seems that there's something behind this, that somebody is paying for a PR campaign. So the bottom line here is that Jews can very rarely get land back in the West Bank that they had owned before 1948. It's an exception. They can get their money back. What about on the Israeli side? What about Palestinian land that is held by the Israeli custodian of absentee property? Well, the vast majority of that land has already been used. And so what's held by the Israeli custodian of absentee property is funds held in trust for the original Palestinian owners, together with cost of living increases and interest, yearly interest and yearly cost of living increases. There's very little land left that has not been disposed of by the custodian and by the Israeli government. So it's a similar situation. However, if farming was the main livelihood of the Palestinian, or really Israeli Arab who lost land during the war that was taken by the Israeli government as absentee property, then the Palestinian farmer, or the Israeli Arab farmer, can get land back from the government. So the actual statistics are as follows from the, this is not exactly up-to-date figures because those are hard to find, but as of a number of years ago, it doesn't change very much these days. The process has slowed down. But about 14,700 claims have been filed by Palestinians. They're encouraged not to file claims by the PLO and by the PA because filing a claim legitimizes Israeli authority and sovereignty. So they're encouraged not to file claims. Despite that, almost 15,000 claims have been filed. Claims have been settled with respect to more than 200,000 dunams of land. Remember, in the case of Sheikh Jarrah, we're talking about 17 dunams. More than 10,000 Israeli shekels have been paid in compensation, and more than 54,000 dunams of replacement land in Israel has been given in compensation. Now, to put this in proper context, not a single penny of compensation has ever been paid to any Jewish owner. More than 500,000 refugees from Arab lands who lost property. Not a single penny of compensation has been paid by those Arab governments, even Arab governments that are at peace with Israel. Jordan, for instance, has a peace treaty with Israel. They were Jews that own land that Jordan took. They've never paid compensation. And obviously Syria, Iraq, Morocco, none of those countries have ever paid any compensation to any Jewish owner. So the Israeli conduct here is extremely generous and extremely one-sided because they give reparations in a sense. They give money back to former Arab landowners. They've given land back to former Arab landowners, despite the fact that under Arab sovereignty, Jews have gotten nothing back. So I will conclude there. We'll be happy to take any questions at the end of the presentations about this and other subjects. But let me just stress that if you hear coverage that leaves out the important fact that this is a private rental dispute, that these are tenants who refuse to pay their rent, and that the Israeli government is not evicting anyone. This is a question of private Israeli owners trying to get their rent paid and failing that, trying to evict the people who refuse to pay rent. If you see that, I would suggest that you first let us know, but also contact the media directly and point out the fact that it is a simple matter of a rental dispute. Okay, so thank you very much, and I now pass it along to Ricky Hollander.
Thanks, Alex. It's important to know that nowhere does history repeat itself quite as often as in Jerusalem and Israel, and that the violence that we're seeing today in the name of defending Jerusalem and Al-Aqsa Mosque follows a nearly century-old pattern. Defend Al-Aqsa, defend Muslim holy sites, and defend Jerusalem from the Jews, or the battle cries we've heard again and again as calls for violent jihad. So I'm going to run through some of this history and then look at the latest iteration. The Defend Al-Aqsa call originated in the 1920s with Hajj Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem from 1921 to 48. He established a very successful strategy to consolidate Muslim support around him, and that was to declare any attempt by Jews to exercise their religious or historical rights in Jerusalem a threat to Islam. Husseini and his followers thus portrayed themselves as defenders of the Muslim faith, using the pretext to kill Jews in the name of Islam. In September of 1928, a small group of Jews put up a mechitza, that's a divider between male and female worshippers, for Yom Kippur prayers at the Western Wall. Husseini proclaimed this an attempt to seize the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and as far-fetched as this was, it was the basis of a very successful propaganda campaign that resulted in beatings and stonings of Jews praying at the wall, and prompting Palestine's British authorities to place restriction on Jewish prayers there. When in 1929, the Jews demonstrated against these restrictions, rumors spread that the Jews had cursed Islam and planned to take over their holy places. And the rallying cry was defend the holy places. Arabs attacked Jews throughout Jerusalem and the rest of Palestine on the basis of this. In Hebron, pictures were handed out at the mosques that purported to show Jerusalem's Dome of the Rock in ruins, and the caption was that Zionists had bombed it. These were fabricated pictures. The result was a massacre where Jewish residents of Hebron were tortured and murdered by their Arab neighbors, incited by this propaganda. And this was followed days later by another gruesome massacre of the Jews in Sfat. Now, this succeeded in putting an end to the Jewish community that had existed in Hebron for many, many centuries. So the tactic was a success for Husseini. And ever since Israel gained control of historic Jerusalem in 1967 and the Temple Mount, the same tactic has been used again and again in the ongoing campaign against Israeli sovereignty. In 1996, Israeli authorities opened and exited the old city from the Western Wall tunnels, far from Al-Aqsa. Violent riots were orchestrated by then leader Yasser Arafat, who declared the opening a big crime against our holy places. And he had his acolyte, Saeb Erekat, falsely claimed that Israel was planning to replace the Al-Aqsa Mosque with a new Jewish temple. When Knesset member Ariel Sharon visited the Temple Mount in September of 2000, without stepping foot in any mosque, Arafat proclaimed the visit an attack on Islam's sacred places. And he used this as the pretext for a years-long deadly intifada that came to be known as the Al-Aqsa Intifada, although it was planned by Arafat well before Sharon's visit to Judaism's holiest site, the Temple Mount. Now, calling on the Palestinian populace to defend Muslim holy sites serves a political purpose. It gives Muslim constituents a clear goal and a focal point for their grievances, and it renews their support for the leader as the guardian of Islam. So it's no wonder that we see both Hamas and Fatah often vying with each other to position themselves as the savior of Jerusalem. In 2014, Abbas and his Fatah colleagues embarked on a campaign of incitement to defend the Al-Aqsa compound by all means. And Hamas also got in on the action by encouraging terror attacks in the name of defending Islam's holy site. And if you recall, the result was car ramming attacks, shootings, and a massacre of worshippers in a Jerusalem synagogue. In 2015, Abbas reprised his role as an instigator of violence by insisting that Jews have no right to defile the Al-Aqsa Mosque with their filthy feet. Those were his words. This was a televised speech. And he encouraged martyrdom in defense of Jerusalem. The result was a nearly year-long wave of violence that was called the Knife Intifada, with stabbing attacks, car rammings, and shootings. In 2017, Abbas encouraged Palestinians to liberate Al-Aqsa when Israeli security forces temporarily closed the holy site to install metal detectors at the entrances following a deadly attack on officers at one of the entrances. So now Hamas and the PA are following the same playbook. The week before Ramadan, which is a time when crowds converge in the Temple Mount for prayers, PATV aired multiple broadcasts of a program that featured a song about Palestinians shooting, bombing, and detonating explosive belts to attack Israelis and to defend Palestine. And this was accompanied by visuals of violence. This was the prelude to the current Defend Jerusalem campaign to start an intifada. Now, the focus of the campaign is ever shifting. We heard about Sheikh Jarrah. Alex just talked about that. But the first pretext was the barrier set up by Israeli police near the Damascus Gate Plaza to restrict mass gatherings after the end of Ramadan prayers. Now, I don't know if this decision was made due to COVID concerns or concerns over potential violence, but Palestinian speakers falsely claimed that it was in order to bar Muslims from praying at the Al-Aqsa Mosque during Ramadan. Riots followed, we know that, with Palestinians throwing stones and Molotov cocktails at the police. And in addition, as Gilad previously alluded to, there were Palestinian youth also attacked passersby who were identifiably Jewish. And these attacks were filmed and posted on TikTok. So when activists from a far-right Israeli group responded by staging a violent march to Damascus Gate and rioting, tensions rose even further. And even though the police managed to arrest, disperse, and bring the Jewish rioters under control, their actions became another focal point of the Al-Aqsa Jerusalem campaign. The Palestinian Prime Minister, Mohammed Shtaya, called it an organized act of state terrorism that was intended to obliterate the Palestinian character of Jerusalem. And as in past Al-Aqsa campaigns, the fire is fueled with social media posts by Fatah officials who use the mantra, "With spirit and blood, we will redeem you, Al-Aqsa Mosque." So old videos from 2014 of Abbas urging violence in the name of Al-Aqsa were reposted on Fatah's Facebook page. Now, Hamas was not to be outdone. So Hamas and other terror groups under Hamas's jurisdiction placed themselves at the center of the battle for Jerusalem and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, threatening Israel and demanding that they remove the barriers. And to underscore these threats, as Gilad had mentioned earlier, they fired dozens of rockets into Israel. Now, the police did remove the barriers on April 25th, and Hamas celebrated this, viewing it as a great success and the result of their campaign, but they didn't end the campaign. The focus was then shifted to Sheikh Jarrah, which Alex just talked about, and the elections, which Sean will soon talk about. Hamas leaders vowed to continue what they called the battle for Jerusalem, and they're calling this Operation Sword of Jerusalem. They urged Arabs across the country to join, and which we see many have done. So we come to the next escalation point, which was Israel's Jerusalem Day, this past Monday. Hamas launched rockets into Jerusalem, and even though the route of the annual Jerusalem Day parade was changed so as to avoid Damascus Gate, there was nevertheless violent rioting all over the old city and the Temple Mount. And Israeli police entered the Temple Mount and Al-Aqsa to bring the violence under control. While they were being pelted with projectiles and stones and fire devices, they try to bring this violence under control. And the Defend Al-Aqsa cry was heard louder than ever. Now, just recently, Hamas, 2 days ago, I think it was, the Hamas spokesman, Hazem Qassem, re-emphasized that this wholesale rocketing of Israel that we're seeing is Hamas's struggle to defend the Palestinians and their holy sites. So it's very important that you keep in mind when you read all the causes, when you read news coverage of what's going on, to remember that while the proximal cause for the unrest continues to shift, the campaign remains the same. The Defend Al-Aqsa is a battle cry, Defend Jerusalem is a battle cry, and it's used as a vehicle to garner Muslim support and wrest control of Jerusalem and Israel from the Jews. And now I'll turn the camera over to Sean to wrap up. Thank you.
Thank you, Ricky, and thank you all for joining us. My thoughts and our thoughts at camera are with our friends, family, and colleagues in Israel. We've talked about Sheikh Jarrah, and it's important to have the facts laid out very succinctly by Alex in order to refute the lies being propagated by the media. That is, in part, what camera does. But it's equally important to note this isn't about Sheikh Jarrah, which is but a pretext, as Alex noted. The rockets, missiles, and suicide drones being launched were not built in a day. It is clear from the operations of Hamas, other Palestinian Gazan terror groups, and Fatah that this is planned. This is about two things, one of which the media ignores and one that it obfuscates and minimizes. First, Palestinian politics, and second, the Islamic Republic of Iran. There could be no understanding what is going on without understanding these two issues. These events that are unfolding are not unfolding in a vacuum. In January 2021, as Ricky noted, Mahmoud Abbas, an octogenarian in the 16th year of a 4-year term, promised to hold elections for the first time in 15 years. In the subsequent months, it became increasingly clear that Abbas's Fatah movement was severely divided, just as it was in 2006, and would likely lose the elections to Hamas, just as it did in 2006. Indeed, by allowing Hamas, a US-designated terrorist group, to participate in the elections, Abbas himself was violating the Oslo Accords. What has followed over the last several months has been a ramped-up campaign of oppression. As Abbas's Fatah forces imprisoned and tortured critics and made death threats to Palestinian American human rights activists. Gunmen even shot at the home of the Secretary General of Fatah. Camera chronicled these abuses in a piece about 2 weeks ago in the National Interest, in which we predicted that Abbas had opened up a Pandora's box. Journalists like Khaled Abu Tameh of the journal Jerusalem Post, who will, by the way, be Camera's featured speaker next week, have written story after story about this infighting. But major Western news outlets like the Washington Post ignored them for months. Indeed, for a 4-month period, the Washington Post didn't write a single report on what would be the first Palestinian elections in a decade and a half. By the end of April, Abbas announced that he was postponing the elections. Hamas and his Fatah rivals warned him, threatened him not to do so. Simultaneously, both Turkey and Jordan have also been agitating events in Jerusalem, both for their own purposes, which I'd be happy to detail further in the Q&A session. Abbas's use of the Al-Aqsa libel that Ricky discussed is an attempt to compete with Hamas, which sees an opportunity in the canceled elections to gain a greater foothold in the PA-ruled areas. Abbas is effectively riding a tiger, but we should be clear that he has the reins and spurs. He is not without independent agency. Hamas smells blood in the water, not only due to Abbas's unpopularity, campaign of repression, the canceled elections, But nothing on this scale happens without permission from Hamas's paymasters in Tehran. Iran is on the march. It is emboldened. Its proxies throughout the region have been increasing attacks. In Yemen, where a massive weapon shipment was recently seized by US officials, and in Lebanon and Iraq, where it has ramped up a campaign of assassination of dissidents, critics, and human rights activists. Meanwhile, and not coincidentally, the US has been engaged in talks with Tehran and Vienna, removing sanctions and seeking to re-enter the so-called Iran deal. As Cameron recently wrote in the Washington Examiner, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. The ongoing violence in many ways is part of a longer pattern. Ricky cited the Al-Aqsa libel and its significance, but it's worth noting just how much what is going on mirrors previous instances, many of which Ricky talked about. In the spring of 1920, Arabs attacked Jews in Jerusalem, murdering them en masse during the Nebi Musa festival. The attackers did so because they felt emboldened and were vying for power. Emboldened because ruling British authorities had encouraged them to attack Jews. This is why the attackers yelled, "Kill the Jews. There is no punishment for killing Jews, and the government is with us." At the time, competing Arab factions were vying for power, and the final establishment of Middle East borders was still to be worked out in the post-World War I era. Both the attackers and the British officials hoped to influence the powers that be back in London. Similarly, in 1929, in the incident that Ricky discussed, when riots broke out in Hebron and elsewhere, the Palestinian leader at the time, Ayman al-Husseini, was also embarking on a campaign to eliminate rivals and gain international support and recognition for his bid to be recognized as not only the leader of Palestinian Arabs, but eventually the ruler of the Middle East. In 1936, the Arab Revolt happened in Palestine, British-ruled Mandate Palestine. This can be properly categorized as the First Intifada, and here too there is a remarkable parallel. Britain and the Western-led liberal order were viewed as on the retreat. The Nazis were rearming and fascism was on the march. Similarly, the violence erupted after the funeral of Sheikh Izzeddin al-Qassam, a rival and critic of Husseini, who was slain after murdering British policemen. Qassam, for whom Hamas has its Qassemite brigades and Qassam rockets named after, had spent years saying that Husseini was a British stooge and was not acting. That eruption of violence was then blessed and backed by Husseini, who was armed and equipped by the authoritarian anti-Semitic powers of the day, the Nazis. Today, it's Iran, but one can see history repeating itself. Indeed, in 1987 and 2000, the old guard of Fatah viewed itself as increasingly unpopular and under attack. In the first instance, by younger Fatah members, and in the latter, by newer groups like Hamas. In 1987, violence erupted, and Arafat and Fatah members in Tunis capitalized and expanded on it, just as Abbas is doing right now. And in 2000, Arafat launched what he called the Al-Aqsa Intifada. Ricky discussed this in great detail. He planned this both as Hamas grew in popularity throughout the 90s and as a US-mediated peace talks were underway. So here too, you can see the pattern repeating itself. All of these intifadas ended in disaster for Palestinians. Indeed, the 2000 Intifada led to Arafat losing his grasp, Abbas taking over and inheriting a Fatah whose members were jailed and dead and low on funds, and consequently lost the elections. The 36-39 Intifada also left the Palestinian movement fractured and broken. Now, however, Fatah and Hamas have help. The media is acting as their de facto propaganda, spreading lies and omitting context. A good example of that is actually the individual that Gilad discussed at the beginning of this webinar, Fatih Hamad, who had called to cut off the heads of Jews with a knife that could be purchased for a couple shekels. Well, Mr. Hamad was apparently eliminated by the IDF in the last 24 hours. However, this came after he was treated as a credible source by the Washington Post in 2019, and after operatives working for Hamad, who ran Hamas's disinformation bureau, were listed as journalists when they were slain in the 2014 conflict with Israel. So this is a war on all fronts. And we at Camera need your help. I'd encourage you all to get involved. Write to and call editors and reporters. We need, and Israel needs, your aid. On that note, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Gilad.
Hi, everyone. I'm back. Thank you all to my colleagues for presenting, and thank you all for participating in this webinar. It's certainly a challenging time in the Middle East. obviously it's hardest by far for the people living there like Tamar. But it's also a difficult time for those of us abroad who believe in Israel's right to security, including including American Jews, 82% of whom say that caring about Israel is important or essential, an important or essential part of what being Jewish means to them. This was according to a Pew poll released just this week. This is up to date, despite the ongoing campaigning against Israel. American Jews still do care deeply about the country. Those of us here abroad and in Israel who are on social media see a lot of outrage, more than outrage. They see a lot of hatred directed at Israel. And as always, it seems to crescendo at what feels like a particularly strange time, the very moment when thousands of Hamas rockets are targeting Jewish civilians. We might be tempted to think that this is somehow compassion for Palestinians that has gone haywire, that has malfunctioned. But I don't think that's the case, because we do see the exact same reactions if this were a war with Hezbollah in Lebanon. If it were a war that started when Hezbollah crossed the border and kidnapped Israelis, and Israel and fired rockets at the north, and Israel was firing back to try to disable those rocket attacks. So it's not the constant here isn't Palestinians. And now more than ever, those spreading the anti-Israel vitriol, and this is what it's really about, I think, when you follow the threads back, these people on social media spreading the vitriol are explicit about their goal being the end of Israel's existence. I've seen influential people on Twitter insisting that the outbreak of this fighting is no less than an incrimination of Zionism itself. And I suggest we think of it as the opposite being true. Zionism means we're able to absorb Jews, we're able to save persecuted Jews from around the world, and then that we're able to try our best to protect them. And whatever questionable policies any given Israeli government might be pursuing at any given time, that this self-reliant life-saving is the essence of what's happening now, and the essence of what people online, including too many journalists, are angry about. And so with that, I'll look through some of the questions that have been asked, and the whole team here will share in answering them. Let's see what we have. Someone asks what happened and why on the Temple Mount and Al-Aqsa. And I think that was more or less covered by Ricky. Just remember, the context was the clashes on the Temple Mount between stone throwing rioters and police occurred with this background well into this era, this period of sort of tensions and clashes in the streets. And so, this was weeks after Hamas rocket fire. This was, after the barricade situation in Damascus Gate that Ricky mentioned. And so the tensions were high. Israel's police presence is always, existent in the Old City in East Jerusalem. And at this point, because of what Ricky and Sean highlighted, Palestinians who left the mosque, and this was pre-planned. Remember, you can see photos, in fact, of the stockpiles of stones that were there on this, what some feel is a very sacred place for the entire Muslim world, and others apparently feel is a place to store stones to throw. But ultimately, what happened, long story short, was rocks and other objects were thrown at Israeli police. There was a riot, and Israeli police, it's the same thing that had happened off of the Temple Mount in the past weeks, had to respond and try to restore order, and that led to clashes and sort of fed into Hamas's, goal, into the pretext that were already existent. And I don't know if I think, Ricky, you covered most of this, and
yeah, it was an attempt to bring the riot under control, and yes, you're right, and it fed into the narrative, to the protect Al-Aqsa narrative, this libel.
So, somebody's asking, agreeing with Cameron's work about the New York Times, and is asking why these media monitoring efforts have had no impact on subscriptions to the Times among U.S. Jews, or on their coverage of events in Israel. how do you make an impact on Times subscriptions? I'm not sure whether it's true that it has had no impact on subscriptions. We certainly don't take the route of beginning with calls and campaigns to boycott or cancel subscriptions, but we do certainly think that people are capable of taking the information that we're sharing and making decisions with it. And does someone else want to answer the question of what impact we've had?
I'll weigh in on that. There's no way of measuring how many subscriptions they've lost or how many subscriptions to their electronic editions, web subscriptions they haven't gotten because of their coverage. But I will say this. I would say that there's no question about the impact we've had on the Times. We can see it based on internal leaks from the Times that have come out, where the executive editor of the Times has scolded his staff for continuing to make the same mistake over and over again. And he said, giving great, succor and encouragement to those who think we can never cover this issue fairly. So there's no question that we've had an impact. We continue to have an impact at the Times, which is very, very important. But just look at the media coverage in Britain, where we were not as active. We are active now, but we were not as active in the past. And see how horrible it is at the Guardian and the BBC. And you see what the Times could be if we weren't paying such close attention to it. In my view, the Times coverage in general on every subject, the Times as a newspaper has gotten much, much worse than it was 10 years ago or even 5 years ago. It's almost unimaginable what has happened to the Times coverage. In part, that's a business decision because they are no longer dependent on advertisers. And therefore, they are no longer dependent on what the public really thinks about them. The Times is dependent on its subscribers, especially its online subscribers. And that means that they're under sort of pressure to give those subscribers what they want. And so I would say most of the subscribers to the Times are not particularly favorable towards Israel. And so there's no reason for the Times to give fair coverage to Israel. They don't lose very much financially by being very unfair to Israel. However, that said, I would say their coverage of Israel has deteriorated much less than their coverage of everything else. So the fact that we are on them so closely and Gilad and others contacting them so often and actually getting changes in coverage, getting corrections, getting changes, I think that's extremely important and it is effective. And as I said, when you look at the state of the British media, BBC, Guardian, The Independent, it's much, much worse. We have a British component that's very active in the last, say, 5 or 10 years, but a lot of damage was already done. Our continued focus on the Times has, I think, been of great effect. There's, if we were to let up, the only experiment would be for us to stop doing it and then see how bad it gets. But I don't think anybody wants us to do that. So I don't think that's an experiment we're going to carry out.
A couple of questioners ask who's funding and supplying the thousands of rockets being fired on Israel. Sean made an effort to respond to that. And someone asks also, do we know the percentage of rockets from Gaza that are coming from Hamas versus from Islamic Jihad or others? And to what degree the source matters, which is also an important portion of the question. Does the buck stop with Hamas in Gaza?
That's a great question. So Hamas is definitely the de facto power in Gaza, of course. It is not the only power that is, of course, launching rockets. There's the Popular Resistance Committees, the DFLP, the PFLP, and a few other smaller orgs. However, they are all virtually funded by Iran to varying extents. Palestinian Islamic Jihad, for example, is 100% funded by Iran. Hamas is once again 100% funded by Iran and also gets some money from Qatar and elsewhere. So Iran is absolutely pulling the strings. Nothing is happening in Gaza without permission from Tehran, which has led, of course, some people to suggest that the U.S. should step out of the talks in Vienna and that perhaps there's some leverage here to prevent these Iranian proxies from launching missiles into Israel. So this is all coming through Iran, and it has to be understood and part of a broader regional context. Iranian proxies elsewhere in Yemen and in Lebanon and Iraq are also ramping up their own attacks to secure an Iranian empire for the mullahs. So That said, I don't think it matters too horribly much who's shooting the rockets. And there are smaller groups that don't have, say, the advanced munitions that Hamas or PIJ have, but they're still shooting out war crimes.
They are still doing it as we speak, despite the great success of the Iron Dome and the best efforts to sort of target the source of these rocketing. And that takes me to a couple other related questions. One of the attendees is asking, can someone explain why a ground campaign is necessary? Can't Israel reestablish deterrence by air alone? And it's a very important question because the massing of the troops that might be auguring a ground campaign, and because what often happens is that the ground campaign will lead to an increase in casualties, particularly of Hamas fighters, and whether or not the Hamas Health Ministry acknowledges the proportion that are fighters is very much questionable. But what happens often in that period of fighting is that people forget the rockets that have gone on for a week or sometimes more that preceded the ground campaign. People think of the war as beginning with the ground campaign. So it's a very interesting question to ask why this campaign might be necessary. And a counterpoint to that, another questioner asks, why must Israel continue to supply water and electricity to Gaza while these rockets are being fired?
Well, I'd like to take both parts of that. Historically, in military history, air commanders have often promised, going back to Douay, have often promised great results from air campaigns. And the thought is that, based on war games and dropping bombs, it looks like it would be absolutely effective and devastating and no one could stand up to it. But historically, that has not been the case. And in many times in history, it's been necessary to bring in a ground campaign as well, unattractive as that is for the obvious reasons. So we'll see. It's really up to Hamas. We will find out. Israel will try to avoid a ground campaign if it can. But if the attacks continue, then they will have to go in on the ground. So it's really up to the Palestinians, and we will see what is necessary and what is not necessary. The other aspect, Dr. Wolf, I think it is, asked, why does Israel continue to supply both electricity and water to the Palestinians in Gaza? Now, let me just say that Gaza is an oasis. It sits on top of an aquifer. That's why it exists. If it wasn't for the aquifer, Gaza would just be another part of the Negev desert. There would be nobody there. However, they're short of water because there's massive overuse by Palestinian farmers who are destroying the aquifer. There's a lot of infiltration of salt water from the Mediterranean into the aquifer, and the water is becoming more and more difficult to drink. Has lots of health consequences, not to mention it doesn't work as well for farming either. Hamas is doing nothing to control water usage, and therefore they're simply allowing this to happen. As far as Israel supplying the water and electricity, I agree. I always say that if the United States was getting attacked by some country, I don't think we'd be giving them water and electricity while they were attacking us. Israel does that, and I guess they've made the calculation that they're better off supplying the water than not supplying the water. However, contrary to what some Palestinians claim, obviously Israel doesn't supply water and electricity to Palestinians in order to control them, because Israel never cuts it off. So what kind of control is that, right? I mean, if they cut off the water and the electricity to the northern Gaza Strip, then you'd say, okay, Israel's giving them water in order to have the threat of cutting it off. But they've never threatened or cut off water at all to the Palestinians in Gaza. And it fulfills an important gap in the Palestinian water networks and supplies water to Gaza City and to about 10 or 15 other major Palestinian communities in Gaza. But that's the reality. The apartheid state of Israel continues to supply water and electricity to the very machine shops that create the rockets that are then fired into Israel. And in fact, in one case, Palestinian rockets damaged the transmission line right outside the Gaza Strip, and power was cut off. So the Israelis sent workers to repair the transmission lines, and the Palestinians started shooting at them. So, that's the reality that Israel lives in.
Does Israel have enough Iron Dome rockets? Someone asks, and I guess I should add: does Israel have enough Iron Dome the firing mechanisms, the actual launchers to protect itself from the hundreds or thousands of, I think right now we're at 1,500-ish rockets from Gaza. So is there a supply concern?
Well, there's a joint production agreement with Raytheon, I believe. So the missiles are also being produced here in the United States. I think it's Raytheon is the partner. So maybe we will be able to ship some missiles over to Israel to help them if they do have a supply shortage. Go ahead, Tamar.
Yeah, just that there is pressure now in the supply, from what I understand, and they are doing their utmost to increase the supply and availability. One statistic I heard today from a former security expert is that the Hamas has some 20,000 rockets, and between the ones that they fired off and that Israel has destroyed in attacks, we've reduced the supply by only 30%. So do the math from there. Small percentage of them are the longer range ones, and the rest are the ones that are used in the communities closer to the Gaza Strip. But at the rate of, say, 600 to 800 rockets a day, we see that this can drag on for quite some time unless Israel is able to step up the rate in destroying the rockets.
And I'd like to tie that in as well to the previous question about deploying ground forces. So one of the clear strategies that Hamas has had here is to overwhelm Iron Dome. And to some extent, they have succeeded. So I think that this is one thing that makes this particular conflict quite different from 2014, 2012, and so on, is that the rules of the game are changing. Hamas has spent the last several years accruing more rockets, advanced munitions, which are completely changing the game in the Middle East, targeted munitions, inventing things like suicide drones, which they deployed today. So this, I think, makes the possibility of a ground incursion more likely, because you have a clear demonstration here that Iron Dome can be overwhelmed, that the last several years have been spent accruing munitions, and that with Iran looking to get a lot more money, there's going to be more of that. So I think that the calculus here is changed than it was in previous conflicts.
Which is why probably the goal, it seems, is going to be to really cut their ability to and their desire to keep up this trickle of rockets that's been tolerated in the past in the south. We only come to an explosion like this when the rockets really reach the center at a certain rate, more than one or two, say. But the fact that now they have demonstrated the capability to overwhelm the Iron Dome, I think that establishes probably new lines for Israel, a new red line, and a new determination to say, until here, no more. We won't continue this ongoing trickle of rocket fire, which every few years explodes into this massive event.
People are wondering, what is the stance of Arab countries who have the increasing number of Arab countries who have diplomatic relations with Israel? Does the shared concern about Iran's belligerence in the Middle East, that between Israel and its new, allies, maybe is too strong a word, but its new partners in the Middle East, affect the way the Arab world is looking at this round of fighting?
I think the biggest factor in terms of the response of the Arab countries, including the Gulf countries that have recently become openly friendly with Israel, is the compelling narrative of the Temple Mount and the Temple Mount, Al-Aqsa, being under attack. And this is something they simply can't ignore. And the responses, even from Arab countries who have now openly, the United Arab Emirates, have been not seemingly so understanding to Israel's position of being under attack.
This is exactly why the Hamas's rocketing has been framed as it's called Operation Jerusalem Sword, because they know that this is a means of getting support from the entire Muslim world for their local. For destroying Israel. It's a means of getting support from the Muslim world and Muslims everywhere.
I think as well, the other chief factor is they're going to be looking to the U.S. to see what the United States statements are. Of course, I think a lot of these countries they need Israel more than Israel needs them in terms of countering Iran. But some of them have been agitating this dispute itself. A good example of that is Jordan has been riling up forces in Sheikh Jarrah and pushing Abbas to take a more militaristic tone. And the UAE and Turkey, of course, Turkey's not Arab, have also been buying up real estate in Jerusalem at a significant rate over the last couple of years. So I think there's a lot of factors at play. And Jordan certainly, which I should note, took a large loan from Qatar a couple of years ago, which I think explains some of its behavior, has not been a positive force in all of this. But I think many will still look to the U.S. to see how they're going to, ultimately play this. But I would completely agree as well with Ricky that really this is, Al-Aqsa holds a broad appeal throughout the Arab world and always has.
And I'll close with the question that someone asks, which is, why doesn't the media have the facts that we have covered now? And to be fair, to some extent, the framing of the question is somewhat reasonable. Many of the journalists on the ground in the Middle East are not necessarily very experienced. We have stories of, we hear stories by way of handlers and fixers of journalists arriving in Jerusalem and asking what this building is behind them, asking their production staff, and the journalist is told, that's the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. So not having facts is part of what's at play, but there's also the question of, there are other reasons why they either don't have the facts, which can be the case sometimes, or are ideologically motivated not to share certain facts. And a lot of that is, to the extent that they don't have the facts, it's because they're working out of a milieu that sort of, like I said earlier, embraces a very specific narrative, and forces news coming out of the Levant, out of the Middle East through this particular frame that sort of allows this narrative to withstand, to avoid being challenged by sort of inconvenient facts that might cause cognitive dissonance. I'd certainly encourage whoever asked that question and others who sort of wonder about this kind of thing to check out. Ari Goldman is a professor of journalism at Columbia School of Journalism, and he wrote an excellent, brief and informative piece called "Telling It Like It Wasn't." He wrote this a while ago, and he was talking about his experience as a young reporter for the New York Times covering the Crown Heights riots. And his experience was that he was on the ground taking notes about what he was seeing. He was the eyes for the New York Times. And then he would run to the phone booth back when they had phone booths and called his editors in the Times building and described to them exactly what he saw, which was attacks against Orthodox Jews by their neighbors. The next morning, Ari Goldman picked up the newspaper, he explains, reads about what's happening in Crown Heights, and reads something that is kind of foreign to him. This is not what is happening, he said to himself. This is, the Times is forcing news, forcing what's actually happening in New York through a particular frame that they preferred, that journalists, that sort of was the narrative that these responsible journalists wanted to sort of maintain. And so what he read about was fighting tit for tat attacks between Jews and their neighbors, which largely the Black community in Crown Heights. And he sort of recounted the story and applied the lessons of what he learned as a warning for other coverage, including the Arab-Israeli conflict. He pointed out that the Middle East is much more complicated than the simplistic narrative of oppressor versus oppressed. But I'll let people can certainly Google "Telling It Like It Wasn't" by Ari Goldman. I'd also suggest they look up some inside accounts by Matthew Friedman, who used to be a reporter for AP and wrote a series of pieces that sort of gives the insider's view of why they don't want to tell the facts that we've shared today.
Sometimes it's also a matter of emphasis, how it's the headline, it's the pull quotes, it's what's emphasized. Sometimes you can find some of these little snippets of these facts deep within the article, but you sort of gloss over it because it's buried in the article. So it's also a matter of editing, I think, a lot.
Well, I want to add something, just a little story. Years ago, we met with the CNN bureau chief in Jerusalem, in the CNN headquarters in Jerusalem, rather cramped headquarters. And we had just taken a tour at that point with Israel Kimke, who was the former head city planner for Jerusalem under Teddy Kollek for many, many years and afterwards as well, and really the top expert on Jerusalem. And we took a tour with him. He could look at houses in Arab neighborhoods and tell you exactly who owns it, and when he went to the wedding of the owner's daughter, etc. He just knew every single home, it seemed, in Jerusalem. And he showed us all the Arab building that was going on in Jerusalem, tremendous building that was going on in Jerusalem, not high rises, but low rises. So you wouldn't see it necessarily if you didn't know what you were looking for. At the time, there were stories on CNN how there was a dwindling Arab population, dwindling Palestinian population of Jerusalem, and the Jews were building and driving out the Arabs, etc. And this is absolutely contrary to what we had just seen. And we told the bureau chief, look, we just had this tour. Why don't you take this tour with Israel Kimke of the Jerusalem Institute, the Israel Institute for Jerusalem Affairs, I think it was, Jerusalem Institute for Israel Affairs. And his response was, well, if you know this, how come no one else knows this? Not exactly the curiosity you'd expect to see from a journalist. You'd think he would say, okay, I'll go take that tour. Well, about 10 months later, the CNN had a huge scandal on their hands that blew up in their faces. And we ran a full page ad in the New York Times, an open letter to Ted Turner at the time, who was the owner. And we said, you've corrected this other story. Why don't you correct the Jerusalem story? And that got their attention, finally, after almost a year. And we got a fax from that Jerusalem bureau chief saying, what was the name of that guy you told me about? And so we told him, and he took the tour, apparently, and CNN, to their credit, did a correction. He said, a year ago, we reported the Jerusalem Arab population was dwindling. In fact, it's growing, and it's growing faster than the Jewish population. And they interviewed the chief Palestinian planner, who said, we can build in Jerusalem with permits, without permits. The Israelis knocked one down, we built 10 more. So that was their correction. But that took a year's worth of effort and a full page out of the New York Times, and the occasion of a scandal blowing up in CNN's face, so that they were sensitive to it. So that's how resistant these journalists can be. And this was a long time ago, before Twitter, before social media pressuring them. That's how resistant they can be to something that goes against the narrative. It's quite amazing that a journalist would say, well, if you know this, how come nobody else knows this? We were astounded by it, but that's what you get.
Indeed. Well, I hope everyone who found this webinar informative and helpful will continue their support for CAMRA, or begin their support for CAMRA. Stay involved, those who are involved, and those who aren't can certainly send an email to letters@camra.org. Mention the webinar in your message and say you'd like to stay informed and receive some of our mailings, and that can hopefully certainly be helpful. And of course, spread the word about CAMRA to your friends and colleagues. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter. And most importantly, spread the word about what's being omitted, what's being ignored in the press today. Ricky mentioned much of the issue is of emphasis, and it's certainly true that the errors of omission, the errors of commission are sometimes easier to spot and sometimes more dramatic. The errors of omission do most of the heavy lifting, I think, and they're much harder to spot. And so unfortunately, it's up to us to both press journalists to give all the relevant context, and if they're not, to share the relevant context ourselves with our friends and family. So thank you again so much for being here, and we hope to see you all again soon.